Alrighty, well, welcome to the 8th episode of the Better Dad Show. I'm your host, Bill Hutchison. You can always find us online by heading over to betterdadshow.com. There you can find the links to all of the social media accounts that we are set up at. Right now we're streaming live on Twitch, DLive, YouTube, and on my personal Instagram, as the Better Dad Show Instagram is not yet live. I'm still trying to work that one out. I need 100 followers on Facebook and on the Better Dad Show. So if you want to follow me over there on Facebook and Instagram, I should be able to start to stream live on those channels. Weird thing is, I was able to stream originally. Then I set up my Instagram, and all of a sudden it went from being able to stream to no longer being able to. So if you head over to betterdadshow.com, you can find a link to all the social media accounts. And if you actually just search for Better Dad Show, you can typically find it on all of those places. So last week we read chapter 7 of the book Better Dads and Stronger Sons. Oops, sorry. Bumped the mic, which is this book here. And we are continuing to read it. My desire for this show is for us to become better dads, better husbands, and better men. So it is something that I'm trying to do personally and something that I'd like us to do together. So last week, there were some questions that I'm hoping you sat down and had a look at. If you have, drop your answers if you feel like sharing in the chat on YouTube, or if you're listening to this afterwards, at betterdadshow.com, where you can find it in the comments. So the questions from last week, which was all about, what was last week? Let's see, last week was making a noble man. And so the questions from last week were to make a list of character traits you want your son to have, to think of the best example you've witnessed of manly behavior and then discuss with your son, and also to tell your son what you think makes a man and then ask him what character traits he thinks are manly. I did not do this, just to confess. I need to, because I feel like going through this book is important. Now, no matter where you are in your journey as a parent, as a father, whether like me, you have teenagers and adults, or maybe you just have, a toddler or a newborn. Things, I feel, what we're learning, we can apply at any stage in our life. So we are going to continue now reading Better Dads, Stronger Sons. Better Dads, Stronger Sons. And we are on chapter 7. This week is all about discipline. So let's read. Discipline isn't punishing, forcing compliance, or stamping out bad behavior. Rather, discipline has to do with teaching proper deportment, caring about others, controlling oneself, and putting someone else's wishes before one's own when the occasion calls for it. That was Lawrence Balter in Who's in Control. We share a home with a dog named Riley. Riley is a dun-colored, 110-pound cur with the disposition of a teddy bear. Part German Shepherd and part Labrador Retriever, Riley's an all-American mutt that thinks my son is his littermate. Riley's 4 years old now, but he still looks and acts like a clumsy barrel-chested mongrel puppy. He has oversized ears, which prick straight up in their fullest glory whenever the words walk, car, or biscuit are murmured, and a long, bulbous snout attached to a hard, lumpy skull. As near as I can tell, he sleeps on one or the other of the kids' beds all day long until they get home from school, when he plays until it's time to go back to bed. Quite a stressful life he leads. Riley Riley's bark is hoarse and cracks like he's perpetually in puberty, and he still hasn't figured out how to lift his leg like every other male dog I've ever seen. I think he's afraid of everything and everybody, but he puts up a good front, good that is, until he rolls over on his back, exposing his belly in submission at the drop of a hat. Frankly, Riley's not the smartest creature God ever created, but he is extremely intelligent in matters pertaining to his own self-gratification. Riley loves dog biscuits, and my wife has made it her mission to teach him to do tricks. For each successful trick, Riley is rewarded with a piece of dog biscuit. Much to my surprise, Riley has learned over the years how to crawl, roll over, sit, shake, stand, and lie down. He has even learned to stay away from a biscuit or other food that has been set down on the floor in front of him. He's developed the self-control to keep away from the biscuit on command even when Suzanne leaves the room for an extended period of time. When she re-enters the room, she will find him still sitting and staring intently at the biscuit. But he will not make any attempt to snatch the treat in her absence. My wife has taught Riley the trait of self-discipline by imposing a series of consequences and rewards to produce a desired behavior. Self-discipline. All children need clear-cut rules, structure, and guidelines. They strive under firm supervision and guidance, but boys, even more than girls, need strong boundaries and discipline from the adults, especially older males in their lives. Discipline comes in two forms, internal and external. Internal discipline, or self-discipline, is what we strive to teach our sons by applying external discipline. External discipline is applied in a variety of forms, allowing them to suffer the consequences of their actions, teaching them the pleasures of delayed gratification, showing them the relationship between hard work and success, and teaching them personal accountability. Boys who are not subject to healthy discipline while growing up tend to live unhappy lives and create chaos in the lives of those around them. When we discipline our sons, we are actually preparing them for much more fulfilling lives. The Bible says that accepting chastening or developing self-discipline is a good thing. Hebrews 12:7 says, "If you endure chastening, God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom a father does not chasten?" In other words, sons are naturally disciplined by their fathers out of love. The book of Proverbs talks often about a father's duty to teach his child discipline. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him properly. Proverbs 13:24. This is followed closely by Proverbs 15:10, which says, "Harsh discipline is for him who forsakes the way, and he who hates correction will die." Unless we forget, the rod and rebuke give wisdom, but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. Proverbs 29:15. God the Father even gets into the act. "My son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor detest his correction. For whom the Lord loves, he corrects, just as the Father the Son in whom he delights." We learned about self-discipline as a character trait of noble masculinity earlier in the book. But we need to delve more deeply into this most essential character trait for men. Here are some reasons why teaching your son discipline is imperative to his growth as a man. Consequences and accountability. Boys need structure and supervision. They need to be civilized. Males must be accountable to someone other than themselves, such as their wife, other men, their father, and God. God has designed us so that we need other people, people who will help hold us accountable to God's laws. Without the accountability, we tend to make our own rules and code of conduct. Boys from an early age need to learn that their actions have positive or negative consequences, and they need to learn that their decisions affect not just them, but others as well. A man's ability to let other people into his life are an important part of willingness to maintain accountability. This kind of openness is a skill in which boys need to be trained. Accountability helps keep males from falling into temptation with soul killers such as drugs, alcohol abuse, gambling, pornography, and adultery. These kind of temptations, which we know destroy families, are one reason why men and boys need accountability in their lives. Training your son to resist temptation and fill his life with righteousness will also help build character in him. It's one reason why I feel like us as dads, we can't just do the live and let live thing with our kids. Not if we actually want to teach them. Not if we actually want them to grow and to mature. I think if we just let everybody just live, live and let live, that leads to narcissism. It leads to lack of self-discipline, which is what this chapter is all about. It's something that's just so important that, It's our role as fathers to teach our kids and to guide our kids and to not let them just figure it out for themselves. And we're giving them such a massive disservice if we don't guide them. We're neglecting the the call that God has for us as fathers if we just let them do their own thing. So it's a harsh one. If you look at where in your life you have just let your kid off, they'll figure it out for themselves. And sometimes you have to fight against that to realize, well, no, God's put you in this role, right? We're not just here to be passive in the raising of our kids, but we need to be active, constantly active. If not, we're failing as parents if we're not actually in there and doing it constantly. Young people also need to be accountable to someone who will push them to exert the effort required in order to achieve their best. A father can apply some of this pressure, but he often needs to bring in outside influences as well. For this reason, involving your son in an organized sport or other activity such as music, art, or other trades can provide him with both a character-building training ground and an accountability partner in the person of the coach or teacher. A coach's or teacher's job description has traditionally been to get more effort and talent out of his players or students than they are capable of extracting from themselves. In addition, a coach's goal is also to teach boys character traits such as hard work, respect, self-discipline, and teamwork. Unfortunately, our culture, with its emphasis on self-esteem and equality, sometimes encourages parents to sabotage the accountability process. For example, in an effort to teach a young man respect and self-discipline, a high school coach can do one of several things. He can take away a player's starting position, limit his playing time, reprimand him in private, or verbally challenge him in front of the team to improve his performance and practice habits. A young man who has never been subjected to accountability in his life often reacts negatively when disciplined this way. Upon being subjected to what he perceives as unfair treatment, the young man runs home crying about how the coach abused him. His parents, of course, are aghast and immediately charge down to complain to the school superintendent. This all too often results in the coach getting fired, sometimes without even being allowed to tell his side of the story. Followed by the coach appealing to the local school board for justice. The board, more often concerned with funding and public relations than with finding the truth, usually backs the superintendent's decisions. During a recent meeting of the firing of a local high school boys baseball coach for allegedly mistreating his players, the one dissenting school board member stated, "I think we're confusing teaching discipline and respect with something else." Ironically, the board voted unanimously that the coach did not verbally or physically abuse anyone on the team, but still upheld the superintendent's firing him. By running too quickly to rescue our sons when things get tough, we teach them that the way out of hard times is to find someone to get them off the hook, rather than teaching them to be accountable to the one in authority. This establishes patterns that will influence them throughout their lives. A boy who avoids accountability becomes a man who is answerable to no one, a recipe for disaster. A situation like the coaching situation just described is a good opportunity to let him learn that he must be accountable for the consequences of his actions. And your role as a father is also to teach your son to submit to legitimate authority in his life, male or female. You best do this by supporting their authority and decisions. Sometimes that does go counter to how we feel as fathers, but we need to remember that we're not just dealing with the child in front of us, but we're trying to grow a man to be, more than what they are now. So by rescuing our sons, you may also be training him to base his decision-making skills on feelings instead of principles. There you go. Emotions are unreliable and subject to change on a whim. Principles are like lighthouses that guide ships away from treacherous rocks that would tear holes in their hulls, sinking the ship and killing all aboard. As a coach, I may know more about your child than you do in some areas of his or her life. I see young men and women under competitive and stressful situations. I work with them intensely for hours every day. I know how they react when challenged and how best to motivate them under certain circumstances. I know that their strengths and weaknesses are. I usually discover what kind of character they have very quickly, and sometimes I even know about personal dilemmas they struggle with that their parents aren't aware of. However, I've never had a parent come up to me and ask me about his or her child. I suspect teachers develop the same knowledge of their students as well. It's unfortunate that parents and coaches or teachers don't work together more often for the best interest of the child. Coaches are not the only authority figures who should hold boys accountable for their actions and behaviors. It's equally important that other males, even those who are peripherally involved, to hold boys accountable for their actions. My son and I try to go on wilderness camping trips each summer. We pack up whatever we can carry on our backs and hike into a remote area of wilderness for 4 or 5 days, living off the land and whatever fish we can catch. We carry some freeze-dried food just in case we need it. Several years ago, we went to the Strawberry Mountain Wilderness in East Oregon. On the way home, we took a detour and stopped at a tiny town of Fossil, Oregon, to dig up some fossils on the side of a hill above the high school football field. Later, we stopped at the only ice cream parlor or casket shop west of the Mississippi. As we sat drinking a delicious milkshake, an interesting event took place. Several tables over from ours sat 2 local teenage girls, a baby, and a scruffy-looking young man who was evidently dating one of the girls. After several minutes, a giant of a man walked in with his 2 little girls. It was clear that the big man knew the teenage girls, as they introduced him to the young man accompanying them. As if suspecting what was to come, the young ladies scurried off to the ice cream counter with the baby and the man's little girls. The big man reached out and said hello, engulfing the younger man's hand in his giant paw. Much to the younger male's surprise, he didn't let go of his hand as their discussion continued. I smiled as I overheard the conversation. While I couldn't hear the younger man's responses, he became more and more visibly uncomfortable as the following discussion ensured. "What's your name, son?" Mumble, mumble. "What school do you go to?" "Where do you live?" Mumble, mumble, mumble. "What's your daddy's name?" Mumble, squeak. "Your family, the Smith people, over near the town of John Day?" "I know your daddy. He's a good man, son. Nice meeting you. Y'all have fun and treat these girls right now." He let go of the boy's hand and walked off to the ice cream counter as the young man nearly crumpled in relief. The big guy had effectively said, "I know who you are, I know where to find you, and I know your family. If anything happens to those girls, you'll be accountable to me." That's how men hold younger males accountable for their actions. I guarantee you that young man will think twice before doing something irresponsible with or to those young ladies. The big man had no vested interest in protecting those girls except the responsibility every man has to look after and protect women. Also, I suspect the gentleman hopes that other men will look after his daughters in the same way when they get older. Unfortunately, this type of manly accountability probably only happens in small rural communities anymore, if at all. Challenging authority. Boys have a natural tendency to challenge authority. It's part of developing the leadership skills that they need later on in life as men. However, a boy needs to learn when leading is appropriate and when following is appropriate. Dads play an intrinsic role in that process. Fathers, blessed with the innate fear factor that God has instilled in their children, are well suited to teach boys when challenging authority is appropriate and when it is not. Sometimes the consequences of mistakes in that area can be quite unpleasant. Better your son learn the lesson in a safe environment with you than later on when it could have more serious consequences. For example, as Frank entered adolescence, hormones that he hadn't yet learned to control kicked in. One day, he naturally got a little mouthy with his mother. Luckily, I happened to overhear his disrespect. I immediately got in his face, saying, "That's my wife you're talking to. I wouldn't let another man talk to her that way, and I'm not going to allow you to either." Needless to say, that one time seems to have done the trick. Not that he hasn't gotten lippy now and then, but when he starts to and sees me look at him, he seems to remember our conversation and makes the effort to control his mouth. Again, this is an example of his using self-discipline to avoid unpleasant consequences. As your son develops his leadership skills, you're apt to bump heads every now and then. My son's 18 years old now. He's developing his critical thinking skills, so he likes to argue. It seems like no matter what I say, he will disagree just to argue with me. He's also going through his know-it-all stage. He certainly knows how to push my buttons. Our home sometimes seems like a young bull and an old bull butting heads in the same pasture. I think it's God's way of preparing him to leave home and preparing or motivating me to let him go. Otherwise, he might be inclined to stay forever. We can't expect our sons to be blindly submissive to every authority figure they encounter, nor would we want them to be. But the proper way to disagree or even challenge authority is not by being disrespectful. Teach your son to think through the reasons he disagrees with someone in authority, not just to react emotionally, and then to present his options respectfully, in a logical manner, and with reasonable evidence to support his conclusions. This will allow him to disagree while not making the other person feel threatened. It'll also garner him respect and help him to develop his leadership skills. Coincidentally, while I was writing this section, my daughter Kelsey came down and snuck a letter addressed to me onto my desk. Kelsey's always been what we politely refer to in mixed company as a strong-willed child. Is that his middle child? Middle daughter? Sounds familiar. She has many good character traits that will someday serve her well in life. Our challenge has been to teach her to control some of her less positive personality traits in order not to sabotage herself until she matures enough to use her strengths wisely. Her letter to me was a very well thought out and respectfully presented opinion on why she should be able to do something that I would normally not agree with. In this case, the forethought she used tells me she has thought through most of the issues and is responsible enough for me to trust her judgment in this situation. So I changed my mind and allowed her the freedom to make her own decisions. Meeting life's various challenges helps prepare your son for the time when he's the authority in his own life. Help your son understand the natural process God is putting him through, one of balancing self-respect with respect for others. It'll benefit him and protect your future relationship. Anger control. Too many of us men use anger as a weapon to attack others or as a shield to protect our feelings. When we pass that coping mechanism onto our sons as a way to deal with and express, then we pass that coping mechanism onto our sons as a way to deal with and express their frustrations. Anger is a God-given emotion. It is the second most often emotion mentioned in the Bible, second only to love. However, anger in men is a secondary emotion often used to mask other emotions. Gary and Carrie Oliver say this about anger in males. Anger is often the only emotion that a male is aware of, though they're surely experiencing a myriad of other emotions as well. For just below the surface, a man has many other, deeper emotions that need to be identified and acknowledged. Hidden underneath, sometimes deep underneath, the surface emotion of anger is fear, hurt, frustration, disappointment, vulnerability, and longing for connections. Boys learn early on that anger can help them deflect attention from these more painful emotions. Anger is safer, and it provides some protection for the frightened and vulnerable self. Anger helps him avoid or at least minimize his pain. Anger provides a surge of energy. It decreases his vulnerability and increases his sense of security. What's more, he tells himself, all real men get angry. In short, boys learn quickly that it's easier to feel anger than it is to feel pain. Having been raised in an alcoholic home, I was brought up in a culture steeped in fear. Fear of everything from whether the ambulance would come to our house that night to the unpredictable reaction that even the most innocent facial expression might provoke. A loud noise would guarantee to arouse an angry reaction in a parent with a hangover. I felt like the ground was never steady under my feet, and the rug might be jerked out from under me at any moment. Because of that, sudden loud noises provoked a fearful reaction in me to this day. That fear response manifests itself in anger as a self-defense mode. Of course, my kids know about this response, and they actually get a charge out of inciting that reaction from me by startling me with loud noises. It's sort of like poking a sleeping bear with a stick, I guess. As a very young man, I realized that anger conquered my fear. If I just got mad, I never had to face the humiliating emotion of being afraid again. After I reached a certain size, my anger protected me, my brothers and sisters, and even my mother from physical abuse. I remember saying to myself, never again will I be afraid of anything or anyone. Of course, that was ridiculous. I spent the majority of my adult life being afraid of many things. However, I covered it up by being angry. Unfortunately, fear and anger are lonely companions, but I clearly remember the moment when I understood the power of anger and how to keep me from acknowledging my fear. Jim used anger to control his fear too. Jim's dad was an abusive alcoholic who beat Jim and his mother. According to Jim, his dad was so angry during his bouts of drunkenness that many times he would come home and paint the kitchen with my blood. Jim grew up angry and discovered football as an outlet for his anger. He played with a ferocity that earned him All-American honors in high school. He was recruited to play in college, where he continued to vent his anger on the football field. He was eventually drafted into the National Football League. Jim says that in college, during his frequent trips to the bars at night, Anytime he would see a man look at a woman the wrong way, he would beat the stuffing out of him. He fought many times, always in anger. Just like his dad, Jim never lost a fight. But during his junior year at college, he ran smack dab into an opponent he couldn't beat, the cross. A man from Campus Crusade for Christ shared the gospel with him. Jim looked up to God and called him Father that night. Immediately, the fighting ended. Several years later, Jim started hanging out with a famous Christian author. This man encouraged Jim to reconcile with his father, to ask his father for forgiveness. Jesus said, "I'll never go to my father and ask for forgiveness. I'm not responsible for what happened when I was a child." His friend persisted. "You sure that you bear no responsibility whatsoever for your relationship with your father today?" "Well, maybe 3% of the problems are my fault, but 97% is his fault," he cried. "Well, Jim, as a Christian, it is your responsibility to accept 100% of the blame for your 3% of fault." There's a challenge for us every day, isn't it? So Jim went home and met with his father. "Dad, will you please forgive me for putting you on a pedestal that you couldn't live up to? Please forgive me for comparing you to my coaches and my girlfriend's fathers." His dad said, "No, I'll never forgive you, because if I did, I would be stuck holding the bag." Left with no other choice, Jim lifted his hands to God right there in front of his dad and cried out, "Father, please, if there's any way to touch my father's heart and soften his pain, please, God, help him." Jim's father broke down in tears and said, "I've never heard anyone talk to God that way." Reaching his hands to the sky, he sobbed, "Please, God, if you could ever love me, please come into my heart too." Jim and his dad spent the next 14 good years as father and son. Help your son learn to understand the underlying causes of anger and then to control his potentially destructive emotion. An understanding of the emotion behind anger can often act as a signpost to point towards healing, as it did with Jim. Far beyond just in controlling and identifying our emotions, understanding the cause of our reaction can lead to healing within ourselves and healing in our relationship. Teach him to work. 16 years ago, I was working as a plant superintendent for a large food processing company. During the fruit harvest season of spring, summer, and fall, I was required to work 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I hated the job and the working conditions. I had accepted the job because it paid well and had good insurance benefits. With a growing family and a newly born child suffering from a birth anomaly that required multiple surgeries, I had no choice but to live up to my responsibilities and keep working. For 6 or 7 months out of the year, I rarely, if ever, saw my family. Between work and travel time, I was home long enough only to shower and sleep for a few hours each day. Suzanne claimed she could see me dying before her eyes, and I felt like a walking zombie most of the time. I remember driving over the I-205 bridge twice a day to and from work. The sun was usually just rising or just setting as I crossed the 3-mile bridge spanning the mighty Columbia River between Oregon and Washington. Every day as I crossed the bridge, I looked down and saw dozens of sailboats sailing down the river. My constant thought was, what on earth do those people do that gives them the income and freedom to live that lifestyle? Those images eventually motivated me to start my own business as a way to attempt to gain some control of my own destiny. Many years later, I had forgotten all about those desperate days driving across the bridge. One day, I found myself under the mid-morning sun traveling across the same bridge on my way to the afternoon Seattle Mariners baseball game. As is sometimes the case, although not as often anymore, I was bemoaning my life and all the struggles God was allowing me to wallow in. As I looked down and saw the sailboats on the water's surface, I remembered that longing I used to experience as I drove over the bridge. Then, the thought suddenly struck me, hey, here I am in the middle of a workday with the time and resources to go to a professional baseball game. I am able to come and go pretty much as I choose. I'm one of those people I used to envy so much. Thank you so much, God, for blessing my life. I achieved that freedom only because I was willing to work harder than others. From a young age, I was blessed with a good work ethic, one of the positive traits my parents instilled in me. I was willing to do the little things that add up to success. Nearly everyone does the big things to get ahead, but those who are willing to take on all the small, unpleasant details are the ones that no one else wants to do are the ones who gradually succeed. Boys need to learn to work. One of the basic tenets of manhood is the need to work. We have to work. It's part of our makeup. Give boys chores at an early age. It keeps them busy and teaches them responsibility. Teach them to budget money by giving them a small allowance. Let your son help you with chores around the house. Patiently teach him how to do certain tasks. Sometimes I find myself asking my son to do something I think is simple, only to realize that no one, namely me, has ever shown him how. I started earning money with lawn mowing jobs and a newspaper route at age 12. One mistake I'm convinced I made is not making my children begin working at an earlier age. And while they did have chores throughout childhood, we never adequately enforced the consequences of not completing them. Now, as I'm getting ready to launch my kids out into the world, I'm concerned that I have not taught them the work ethic required in order to succeed in our world. I think as parents, we can always look back and see how we could have done better and hope that it's not too late. One of the major factors in marital failure in our country is financial pressure, and my son will one day face such pressure to support and provide for his family. Fathers face tough decisions in these areas all the time. I recently read about a father who, rather than have his children attend a hopelessly inadequate public school in a crime-infested neighborhood, moved his kids into an attic so he could afford to send his kids to private Catholic school. A tough choice, but I admire him for it. I also wish I had spent more time teaching my son how to budget his money. Because my wife and I didn't learn certain skills early in life, such as how to properly budget our resources and consistently save a portion of our monthly income, we found ourselves hampered with constant debt management and sometimes poor stewardship of the resources with which God has blessed us. These things have probably decreased our effectiveness in doing God's work and God's willingness to utilize us. Preparation for work and financial responsibility is one of the biggest factors that determines a person's success or failure. Lucky is just being well prepared and ready to act when opportunity knocks. Does your son know how to look at a project you've given him and break it down into its separate components? Can he then design a plan to accomplish each phase of the project in the proper order? Can he balance a checkbook? Does he know to tithe 10% to God right off the top of his income and then save 10% after that? Does he know how devastatingly improperly used credit can be and how hard it is to pay off credit card debt? These are all skills he will need to be proficient in when he goes out into the world. His wife and children will depend on his financial acumen. Preparing him well in these areas will give him a big advantage and head start in life. That's the chapter. So as always, there are some questions that it would be great if you wanted to comment on the YouTube video or on betterdadshow.com in the comments. So these are the questions. And I'll actually write out these questions too at betterdadshow.com so you can read them and then reflect on them. So questions for reflection and discussion. 1. In what areas of your son's life are you holding him accountable? Have you given another man permission to hold you accountable? I used to have an accountability partner years ago. But now, we've talked about how, we've talked previously on the podcast how important it is to have friends around you. I think I talked about the 10 and 10, 10 men that you can rely on in 10 miles, or 10 kilometers if you're in most of the world that uses metric. Yeah. Something good to have that I don't at the moment. Number 2, look for times your son gets angry. Discuss with him the possible underlying reasons he reacted in anger. Was he really scared, frustrated, intimidated, hungry, or was it something else? 3, what chores have you assigned your son? How is he held accountable to complete them? And 4, if your son is still young, decide before he gets to the appropriate age how you would develop a work ethic in him. Well, there we go. That's it. That is chapter 7. Next chapter is loving your wife. So that is the next one. So some challenging words there about just how we discipline our kids and how we actually raise them up to be responsible men. All right. To be responsible in their own lives and for the people around them. So I was actually listening to another dad podcast earlier this week called the Thinking Dad Podcast. And something that they said really stood out to me because oftentimes, when I'll sit down with our family and we'll pray together, I've been trying to do that at least once a week, preferably beginning of the week, so we can move forward in prayer. And sometimes I feel like God has a message that I can share with the family. Sometimes I don't. But this Thinking Dad podcast, one of their guests actually said something that is important to us who sometimes don't know what to say. We don't know how to lead. But what they said was that if you can read, you can lead. So us as men, hopefully following after what God's plan is, we have the Bible. And we can always find a story, ask God, what story do you want me to share this week with my family? And we can read that, and just reading, we can let God minister through us. And it's not always on us. Like, yes, God has a role for us in our family, right? But we can, sometimes the best thing we can do is just bring God's word. And so if you can read, you can lead. So that's just something to think about, something that's been marinating in my head, I guess you could say. Now, this is a Value for Value podcast. If it provides a value for you, please share, like, and subscribe. If you're on YouTube or in your own podcast player. And then also you can provide donations by heading over to betterdadshow.com to help cover the running costs of the servers, the website, stuff like that. And feel free to share. So thank you very much. We appreciate you listening again. And next week we will be talking about loving your wives and how by loving our wives, it helps us to be better dads, better men, and better husbands. So thank you.